Andrei, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I'm a professor of philosophy and co-director of the cognitive science program at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, in the Hudson Valley. Um, I work primarily on issues in metaphysics, particularly issues in the metaphysics of mind and agency, and the metaphysics of the divine in philosophy of religion. And broadly, what unifies the sort of approach that I take is one that's ontologically naturalistic. Um, and yeah, so I mean, all that I work on is all of a piece with one another, if you'd like, right? So all the problems that I work on, and I know that you want to talk about philosophy of religion. In philosophy of religion are just extensions of stuff that I work on in the metaphysics of mind and agency and nearby issues like in metaphysics of causation. So broadly, I'm a metaphysician with some interest in philosophy of religion. So
Cool. And so you are a pantheist, is that correct?
I don't know if I'd say I'm a pantheist. That's my default view of God. So if God exists, I think the most plausible conception of God would be pantheistic. Yes, you can call me a default pantheist. How does that sound? But I mean,
Sure.
broadly, I would say I'm an agnostic. I don't know. I think it's the interesting thing about pantheism to me that makes it a little bit more tenable than, say, supernaturalist views of the divine would be that it's a view of God that is susceptible to confirmatory or disconfirmatory evidence, right? So in that respect, it strikes me as being a more interesting alternative. So I'll call myself a default pantheist, but strictly speaking, I guess I'm an agnostic.
What would be the properties of God if your version of pantheism was true? Is it still like omnipotent, omniscient, conscious, intentionality, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So it really depends on what version of pantheism we're going to go with. So, I mean, it's in terms of what omni properties God could have. I think that the most tenable versions of pantheism are going to be ones on which we understand the divine as being a mind. Otherwise, what you have is something like a kind of pan-ultimism, is what I've suggested else in some of my work, where you just have some sort of object of ultimate religious devotion or something like that, and that's the universe. Well, that's not very interesting. So I think if pantheism is going to be an interesting hypothesis about the nature of the divine, about the metaphysics of the divine, then we should take the universe then to be a mind, right? So, and if the universe is a mind, now we can get the ball rolling and start thinking, what kind of mind are we talking about? Is it a conscious mind? I think it's going to have intentionality, because intentionality, following Brentano, I take it, that's the mark of the mental. So it's going to have intentionality. And I think we end up getting that just from the actual just nature of just physical properties, right? If you think about properties of things, they're directed at various kinds of interactions with one another. So you have, right, the roots of intentionality are found just in the stuff that the universe is made of. So now the interesting question is can that stuff be combined in such a way that it can constitute a mind? And I take it that, again, if it's going to be an interesting claim about minds, then it should be something conscious, right? So I want to say it's going to be something that's going to be a conscious mind. Now, about omni properties, that's tricky, right? So that's where we now have to start considering whether we're talking about a personal version of pantheism or an impersonal version of pantheism. So on impersonal versions, there isn't some sort of self-other distinction between the divine and you and I and so on. And on that kind of a view, I take it that starting to talk about omni properties might be a bit strained. But I think that the one omni property, that if God is a mind, once again, and the universe is the kind of system that can be a mind, and I could talk a bit more about that in a bit, but then, right, God would get omniscience for free, I think, right? Because God would be processing information, right, that would be processed, right, throughout the entire universe, right? So we're talking about one mind that's constituted by this whole thing, which is the universe. Then I think you could probably get omniscience pretty easily. But in terms of the other omni properties, I think it's gonna be a hard sell unless you punt up to a version of what's sometimes called personal pantheism. So now with personal pantheism, you get a self-other distinction, and now you might start talking about a being that may have developed certain sorts of properties. But again, I think it's going to be tough, I think, to make the argument that you have anything that is anything like, let's say, the omni-god that the traditional theist is interested in when you start talking about pantheistic being, because they're interested in something that's going to be essentially, let's suppose that you can make a case for God being omnibenevolent, which I don't think you can, but I suppose you could on pantheism. I think that you're going to have difficulty making the case that God would be essentially omnibenevolent, right? Because I mean, the universe is, number one, the universe could have been different. Number two, the universe seems like it's full of a whole lot of evil. So I think it's going to be difficult, I think, to make that sort of case. So I don't, as it stands, I don't see pantheism being committed to any of those various sorts of omni attributes. But again, as I mentioned, I think the one that one can make the easiest sort of case for would be something like omniscience. And the reason, again, would just be, I take it that what we're talking about is, again, a system that's a mind that's processing information that would be right happening throughout, throughout all the universe. So yeah.
Why would you prefer those versions of pantheism as opposed to something like naturalistic pantheism, where it's just nothing that goes beyond the ontological commitments of science kind of stuff, just straight up naturalism, materialism?
Oh, this is naturalistic. I mean, it's ontologically naturalistic. So we have to define what we mean by naturalism first off. So in terms of methodological naturalism, no, it's not methodologically naturalistic, but I don't think you could be a pantheist and be a methodological naturalist. Because then what you're going to be saying is the way that we can know things is only using the methods of science. So I take it that insofar as I would be committed to methodological naturalism, it would be that using the methods of natural science, we can determine what the stuff is, right, in the universe. But that doesn't tell us the complete story, right? So that's where then we can move beyond, right, what we can get through using scientific methods. So I'm committed then to ontological naturalism, which would just be the idea that the only stuff that exists would be the stuff that's constitutive of the space-time continuum, right? So that's it. There's nothing else. There's nothing spiritual. There's no additional properties. It's just the universe, but the universe on this sort of account would be configured in such a way that it's the kind of information processing system that can count as a mind.
So one question is, there's the consensus in physics that space and time is emergent. So there's stuff more fundamental than space time, but we'd still call that natural, I imagine, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm just using the space time continuum just as a placeholder. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So just the block universe.
So the kind of pantheism I prefer, naturalistic pantheism, is essentially just scientific pantheism, nothing beyond science. So no consciousness beyond just an emergent property of the brains, no intelligibility kind of stuff beyond brains. It's just the things supported by the standard model of physics, more or less. And until anything more is discovered in science, that's kind of the most fundamental stuff we have evidence for, and that's it, kind of a version. So why would we prefer the kind that thinks there is some kind of intentionality or consciousness beyond brains to one that's more straight scientific, materialist, that's just quantum fields and that's it, no consciousness beyond brains?
Yeah, well, I guess some of this might have to do with our starting point, right? So where I'm starting from is, again, as I mentioned, being a metaphysician. So of course I'm going to engage in this sort of speculation, but I'm also somebody who thinks about metaphysical issues in cognitive science. And in cognitive science, sort of the standard view that we accept is computationalism about minds, right? So minds are computational systems. They're computing systems. And of course, you get this interesting sort of position that you find out there, which is, pan-computationalism. So some people will argue that the universe is a giant information processing system. So as I take it, that sort of gives us a toehold for understanding the universe as possibly being a mind. Again, I'm not committed to the idea of it being a mind, but the idea is if it's going to be an interesting hypothesis, I take it that the universe is going to have to be a mind, as opposed to just some, again, just a merely physical system that doesn't actually have the sorts of characteristics of minds. So my thought here is this: there's nothing I take it about having wet stuff right in between ears that is going to be a necessary condition for counting as being a mind, right? So in principle, right, any sort of information processing system, right, if it's configured in the right sort of way, could be a mind. And again, as I see it, the matter itself would have to be something that's pregnant with consciousness. Otherwise, consciousness is something really spooky and weird. So as I see it, then commitments to things like a kind of neutral monism, that's sort of a background assumption that I have here, and a commitment to a computational view of the mind opens the door then for the possibility, at least it being a metaphysical possibility, assuming a naturalistic framework here, again, ontologically naturalistic, that you could then have the universe being itself a mind, right? As opposed to just, right, some sort of system that's just an object of religious devotion, but is not a mind. And I'll just quickly note that this sort of mind position that I'm taking here with respect to pantheism has been the sort of standard view that you find amongst people that have been described as pantheists, at least in the history of philosophy. It's been, so if you look at somebody like Spinoza, for instance, there's some debate about whether Spinoza should be read as a pantheist or a panentheist. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not a historian of philosophy. But if you look at Spinoza, Spinoza is talking about, right, God or nature, right, which he takes to be, right, the same thing. And he's, right, explicit about describing that thing as being a mind. So I take that as being sort of a starting point, right? So can we make a case for, right, the coherence of a metaphysics of the divine on which the universe is a mind and then is a proper object of religious devotion? So that's the thought here. So I don't know how much of the yeah, I mean, I guess the watershed difference between what you're describing and what I'm describing is what you're describing is a view on which pantheism would exclude the claim about the universe being a mind. Whereas what I'm saying is that would have to be, if it's going to be an interesting thesis, right? If it's going to be an interesting metaphysics of the divine, then it ought to be one where, right, it's going to count as being a mind.
What do you mean by interesting thesis? Because I'm not sure. Like when you say that, I don't know what it means or.
Well, otherwise, I think all you have is just what, like as I mentioned before, a sort of pan-ultimism, right? So John Schellenberg, he's in his work in philosophy of religion, where he's sort of trying to, he has his book Prolegomena to Philosophy of Religion, where he's sort of trying to sort of revisit what we're doing in doing philosophy of religion, because all too often, well, at least in the past 50 years, 100 years, philosophy of religion has largely been driven by the interests of Christian theists, traditional Christian theists, and their opponents, and that's it. It's been this back and forth between those two sides. And Schellenberg and others, including myself, have tried to sort of open the space to try to think about other sorts of conceptions of ultimate reality, or whatever you want to call it. And Schellenberg says, okay, here's what's going to be characteristic of religions, right? So he offers some various criteria, but one of them is that you have some sort of object of devotion, which is an ultimate, right? It's undefined, right? So you get ultimism. So as I see it, if we don't go with the mind, the sort of direction that I suggest in my own work, which is, right, if it's going to be an interesting thesis that's going to be distinguishable from pan-ultimism, then it should be a mind, right? Otherwise, all we have is just sort of a, I know not what, but it's an ultimate object of religious devotion. But now the theism part, right, if you will, of pantheism seems to be lost, right? And that's where I think, you know, if you look at the Stoics and you look at Spinoza, and then you look at people after that, like Schelling and other people like this, when they're talking about pantheism, they have in mind a view on which the universe ends up being a system that you can describe as being a mind, again, as opposed to just a I know not what, if you will, kind of thing, or just a mere physical system that's an object of religious wonder and awe and so on. And again, I think it's better to describe that kind of a view as pan-ultimism, but of course people are free to use whatever language they want to describe these positions. That's fine.
So what, how would this mind work exactly? Because I'm thinking from the perspective of physics, like there's a speed of light, information can't travel faster than the speed of light. So if
Right.
the universe as a whole is some kind of information processing system, it doesn't seem like information could get from one side to the other in any meaningful sense. So it'd have to be like a whole bunch of different ones all working together.
Right. I mean, number one, I in my own work, in terms of a philosophy of time that I think is correct, I assume a sort of block universe and eternalism. So I think what you'd have is you'd have the entire block, right, and the processing of the information, right, in sort of one snapshot, if you will, right. So I don't know if that's going to help with the problems of physics here, right, in terms of how the speed of the information being processed. But now what you're talking about, though, is a system that would be just unlike any others that we're encountering. I mean, but of course, right, there's different ways that you might think about this kind of thing. I mean, one sort of some alternative approaches that people have adopted, having people like Paul Draper, for instance, who basically have said, no, what you have on this sort of view that's going to be the most plausible version of something like pantheism, but it's not pantheism, is where you end up getting the divine as something, a feature of the universe, right, as opposed to the totality of the universe, right? So now what you might do is localize the processing of information in, right, a space that's going to be smaller than the entirety of the universe. And I haven't really thought about how to sort of think about these sorts of alternatives like what Paul Draper has, or Samuel Alexander was somebody like this too, who had this idea of a kind of pan-in-theism, right, where God is an emergent feature of the universe, right, itself, but not the entirety of the universe. And God isn't universe plus, it's just what you have is something that's a feature of it. So that might be a way, right, that one can make this work, but I don't know if that would be pantheism anymore. As I mentioned before, I think it would be something else, like pan-in-theism, not pan-en-theism, but an in-theism. So yeah, so I think I think it's an interesting question about how to make this sort of account then work with physics. The thing that I'm interested in, again, as a philosopher, is whether or not you could just have a coherent picture. But that's where it goes back to this point that I made about pantheism and why I think it's so interesting as a metaphysics of the divine, is that you have a metaphysics that's unlike traditional theism, that is, in this case, at least in principle, can be confirmed or disconfirmed by, right, available evidence that we have, right? I mean, is this a model of the divine that is that will work or not, right? And if it doesn't, then then so much the worse for it. Then it's not going to go. It's not going to work. But again, this is a view of the divine that has been largely just ignored for much of at least the recent history of analytic philosophy of religion. So hence that's why I work on this stuff.
Yeah, philosophy of religion ignored everything other than Christianity for the most part.
Yeah, exactly. For the last 50 years. Yeah, it's really only been within the last
evidence. You mentioned that this could be indicated by evidence. What kind of evidence would indicate this?
I think it ultimately would have to be scientific evidence. Yeah, but I just don't.
Well, like specifically, what kind of scientific evidence?
Oh, from physics, of course. Yeah, I think it would have to be information. It would have to be coming from physics. So yeah.
I mean, like, could you give a specific example of what physics could discover that could indicate that there was such a mind?
Oh, good. That's a good question. So, there's this recent work. I can't just totally drawing a blank, but there's a recent article. It was in Frontiers in Physics about just the structure of the universe. And in this case, this was a neuroscientist and a physicist. And I mentioned this in my little book on pantheism. And in this case, what they noticed just an interesting sort of isomorphism between the kind of the structure of systems like brains in the universe. So, right, and in this case, the claim then being that what you have is something that is, at least in principle, the kind of system that at least exhibits the sort of structure that is that we're familiar with, right, in the information processing systems that we know count as minds, namely in this case, mammalian brains. So information, so I take it, evidence like this, I think, is interesting. And I think that's the type of thing that we're interested, that would be, again, counting in favor of something like pantheism. But again, I don't want to suggest that this particular article is providing anything like, decisive, right, evidence that would confirm pantheism. If anything, it's an interesting sort of data point that suggests that it's not just absolutely batshit crazy. So that would be the kind of thing that I think that we would need to be pointing to, is, again, whether or not you have the universe exhibits the kind of structure that is going to be characteristic of information processing systems. And again, you have people like pan-computationalists who've made these sorts of arguments for this kind of a view. But I don't take that the arguments that they're providing are in any sense decisive. And even if they were conclusive, right, that what you have is a giant information processing system. To get the step further to what I'm arguing for, which would be you'd have a mind, I don't know if scientific evidence will get us to that point. The question is does it have the kind of structure where it could at least, right, satisfy a necessary condition for being a mind, which is it's an information processing system. If it doesn't have that kind of structure, then it's off the table, right? So,
well, do you think the analogy arguments work to provide that? Because I think that when people make those kinds of arguments from analogy, that looks like the image of a neural network kind of looks like the image of a star system cluster or something, cluster of galaxies. To me, it seems like simply because the shape looks the same, I don't think it has the necessary conditions to be an information processor, simply because it looks the same. Because it's like
that's not going to be enough, right?
Right. So like the golden ratio, we see the golden ratio in a lot of different things. You can't say a seashell is the same as a sunflower leaf because they both have the golden ratio. So what exactly are we looking at in the universe that could qualify as an information processing system analogous to a neural network of some kind?
Yeah, I think that's tricky. And I for what it's worth, when it comes to that question, that's where I'll leave it to people in lab coats. Does that make sense? So exactly what we're going to have to get to that place, I don't have an answer to. As I see it, again, you have the people that are working. Again, you get the pan computationalists and people who are working on this kind of stuff about whether or not the universe can be an information processing system. And their training is such that, right, it equips them for answering that sort of question. So again, that's where I stop, right? But right at this point, as I see it, you then have this open question, right? Is the universe the kind of thing that exhibits that kind of unity, right? That is characteristic of, right, systems that process information in the way that's characteristic of cognition. Again, as I say, it's just an open question. So, but again, it's one where that's where I just have to say I'm a philosopher, and I just have to beg off and say that we'll leave that to the scientists to answer that question. So,
Is that similar to like the fine tuning argument for the theistic God, where it's like saying that there's some kind of set of complex ways that the universe interacts, and that complex ways is indicative of minds, like information processing, more so than non-minds, something like that?
yeah, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. Somebody who has a little bit has been Philip Goff. So Philip, and same thing with actually Peter Forrest too. Philip has a paper on what he calls his view agential cosmopsychism, which, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a version of pantheism. And on his view, what he then appeals to is the notion of the universe as a mind, as being a simpler explanation of fine-tuning than either the multiverse hypothesis or the traditional omni-God hypothesis, right? The idea now being that you have, right, so he assumes priority cosmopsychism. So the whole thing is, which assumes priority monism, which is the idea that the universe is one single substance, and then you then have, right, and that substance is a mental substance, right? And his argument is, in this case, right, the universe basically, right, for reasons of its own, right, ends up, right, starting off, right, as being the kind of system that ends up being conducive to life, right? So he gives a sort of argument for a kind of fine tuning, which is it's not a direct argument or even indirect argument necessarily for his sort of view, but the thought is right, we have fine tuning for life. This is a simpler explanation, and it does as much explanatory work as the multiverse hypothesis and as much explanatory work as the traditional theist view. So it seems like it's a candidate view that we ought to be taking seriously. And it has the advantage of being simpler than either of the two, because we're not positing multiverse and we're not positing the existence of anything outside of the universe. So, I mean, so that's an interesting sort of argument. I don't know if that's directly answering your question. I mean, indirectly sort of getting there, which is the idea being, I think that kind of thing might be something you might appeal to if you're looking for evidence. But again, I haven't really thought too much. I usually don't get embroiled in these kinds of epistemological debates. It's more about, can we actually have a coherent model? And is it a coherent model that is at least consistent with, right, what we know about the universe, or not, right? And I take it that, right, that you can sort of work out versions of pantheism that are going to be more or less consistent, right, with our best current science. But at the end of the day, it may prove not to be tenable, and that's fine, right? So I think that's where it's different, I think, again, from traditional theism in that respect. You just sort of, okay, well, I guess that's it's off the table. God doesn't exist, right? So.
In your view, did the consciousness, you mentioned the block universe, has the consciousness always been there, or did the consciousness evolve from some state? Because if you're making an analogy from the shape of star systems or something to neurons or something, then it seems like prior to that point in time where that structure existed, if that structure is what is facilitating the conscious state, then there wouldn't be a conscious state. So that would have to come about after billions of years of cosmic evolution, and then the consciousness would arise.
Yeah.
And if that was the case, would that even qualify as a version of pantheism? Is it possible for the pantheistic kind of a God being to come about from evolution of star systems, or would it need to be fundamental to the universe to even qualify as a form of theism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you're going to find people being of two minds. Some people are going to say that if it's going to qualify as a version of theism, then it needs to be there from the beginning. And I think Peter Forrest approximates this sort of view. So Peter's a personal pantheist. Again, I'm an agnostic about that debate. I think the personal pantheist has some advantages over the impersonal and vice versa. But he says from the go, right, you end up having this sort of conscious system. And again, Philip Goff's view would be like that too. For myself, I actually don't have any problem with the idea of it being something that's an emergent feature. Not in the sense of strong emergence, which is to say, right, where you have strong emergence, you're going to have novel stuff, but weak emergence, which is, right, you just wouldn't
Something
expect
from
it.
nothing, new
Yeah,
things from nothing.
yeah. So in this case, I want that it's going to be just that the universe now exhibits the kind of complexity that's necessary for it to now be conscious, but it's not anything over and above the stuff itself. And so I don't see a problem with that being that kind of emergent view, right? Where it takes time, and you'll actually have some people even who have been proponents of panentheism who've taken that kind of view. Only they've said that it's strongly emergent. So Arthur Peacock is somebody who has a view that I think approximates this, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that, but but I don't think it's going to be any less. Now, of course, the traditional theist is going to say, "Hell no, that's not theism, then," right? And I'll just say, "Okay, fine." I mean, I'm talking about pantheism, so you folks are going to say I'm an atheist anyhow, so it's fine. But yeah, I don't see that much hanging on that. Somebody who's taken a view like that, actually, that just comes to mind is actually John Bishop. So John Bishop, with his view, with his work, he's not a pantheist. He calls his version, he calls it a kind of panentheism, but he takes the divine to be something that's an emergent feature of the universe. So again, so you have these sorts of people like this, and John describes himself even as a Christian at that. And so you'll have people like this who've taken those sorts of views, who've argued for it then being, that it's a perfectly fine candidate, right, for being God, right? So I don't know if it matters much, but I think that you'll probably find some people who will probably think it does matter, but I don't see it as mattering all that much any more than I see it being a problem. We start thinking about organisms like ourselves, right? I don't think I had a mind necessarily, right, when I was, prior to birth, right? So, definitely not before, the neural connections were in place, right, for me to, right, again, process information in the way that's going to be characteristic of a mind. And that's, well, not until pretty late into fetal development, right, where that ends up happening. So we see this all the time when it comes to organisms. So why shouldn't that be a feature of the universe? I don't really see a problem with that necessarily. So
You said your focus is trying to make a coherent model of pantheism.
yeah.
Is it possible to do that given that we don't really know what consciousness is? I know that you said that consciousness is computation. I know Roger Penrose disagrees and says it's not just computation, you need something else there. If we don't know exactly what consciousness is it possible to make a coherent model? Because it seems like you're just placing a big variable x, whatever x is, it could be done by
Yeah,
this.
no, it's good. Yeah, so I talk about this actually in my little book. Yeah, I think that, so here we have to actually start talking about ontology. So on the one hand, you'll get some people who are cosmopsychists like Philip Goff, and other panpsychists, I think, have a sort of answer here, which is it's that the universe, right, either the universe itself from go is a conscious system, and they're going to have a kind of problem of division. That's their problem, right? Which is, how does it now then divide up into these discrete centers of consciousness that are you and me, that we can distinguish from the whole, right, which is the universe. On the other hand, you get your sort of micropsychist, the traditional panpsychist, and they're going to say that fundamental stuff, right, that the universe is made of is itself, right? There's something it's like. It's not going to be very robust or very interesting, but of course their problem is how does that stuff combine, right, to be minds like you and me? And now if you start thinking about the whole, with the whole universe, right, if the whole universe is itself a conscious system. So my approach is, I've discussed some difficulties with those sorts of those panpsychist options, cosmopsychism and micropsychism, namely this combination problem and the problem of how you're going to individuate, right, systems, right, that are going to be themselves discrete conscious subjects. My approach is to adopt a version of what's called pan-protopsychism. So I think that the universe, as I mentioned earlier, I think the universe, right, the stuff, right, that the universe is made of is pregnant, right, with mentality. I don't think it's mental stuff, but it's pregnant with it, if you will, right? So the idea here then being that, and if you recall, I mentioned that I think that intentionality is something that we see all over the place. So on the view of properties that I think makes the most sense, the properties of objects are what we call powerful qualities. So they're both qualities and they're powers. And as a power, right, what you have is the property of something is going to be directed at various kinds of manifestations with appropriate manifestation partners. So here's a really simple example, right? Sodium chloride and H2O, right? Sodium chloride is directed at dissolving, right, when it comes into contact with H2O. H2O is directed at dissolving sodium chloride, right, when it comes into contact with it, right? So the two, right, chemical compounds in this case are going to be directed at these particular manifestations when they come into contact with each other.
What do you mean by directed at?
The idea then being that right, they exhibit a kind of intentionality, what George Molnar called physical intentionality, where right they are, if even if you had a quantity of sodium chloride that is, we're having connection issues. It looks like. Sorry, hopefully it's restoring it. Okay, so if you had a quantity of sodium chloride that is in a remote part of the universe where there's no H2O, right, it would still be the case that if it were to come into contact with H2O, it would dissolve, right, in the water. So, so the idea here is right that you have then right the properties of right the objects themselves, right, the properties of those things are directed at right a particular manifestation. But again, by saying directed at, what I mean is right, if it were brought into contact with something, then it would act in this kind of a sort of way, right? And the truth maker now for that if-then claim is going to be that property of the object, right? Namely, in this case, it's soluble, right? H2O, I'm sorry, not H2O, sodium chloride is soluble, right? Its solubility is such that, right, it has the power to be dissolved by water, right? It can be dissolved by water. So that's all I mean by directionality is you have that sort of, right, it's pointing at these sorts of interactions, these outcomes, right, even in the absence of that stuff, right? It has that disposition for, right, a particular manifestation. And that's that disposition for something, as I see it, that's what I mean by, again, a kind of directionality. And that is going to be something that we find then when we think about the intentionality that's characteristic of mental systems, right? What you're going to have is you're going to have a thought is directed at something, right? It's about something, it's for something. So it's just, in this case, it's now going to be something with a certain kind of representational content. But as I see it, right, the objects themselves, right, the fundamental objects and their properties are going to be such that when they're configured in the right sort of way, then they're going to be exhibiting that more robust kind of intentionality. And because these are also qualitative, right, these things are both powers and their qualities, right, they're ways that things are, right, they're going to be giving rise then to the things, what's going to be characteristic of conscious experience. Now, that doesn't mean that, oh, yeah, we've taken care of the problem of consciousness or anything like that. But the point is I think that how we answer, right, questions about the problem of consciousness in a lot of ways is going to be dependent upon what our metaphysics are when it comes to things like properties. And so again, the panpsychist is giving, the panpsychist is giving a particular metaphysics of those properties. In this case, what I'm suggesting is that we have something that's proto-mental. It's not mental, but it's proto-mental. And otherwise, if we don't go that route, I think then we turn it into a mystery, and I want to avoid mysteries if I can. So
I don't think I'm following how the salt dissolving in water is somehow a level of intentionality in any sense. Because for me, like simply the fact that there's some cause and effect or necessary connection between two objects that they interact in some way, I don't understand how that could be analogous to an intentionality in any way.
Yeah. Okay. Think about it like this. All right. So when you start talking about intentionality, right, what's going to be characteristic of intentionality is that it's aboutness, right, or forness, right? Okay. So I can have a thought about, right, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is not here, right? I can have a thought about Abraham Lincoln, though, right? So there's something that's not here about which I can have a thought, and the thought is directed at that. Right, it's about that. So the thought now would be take again the sodium chloride and its power, right, of solubility, right, of being dissolved, right. So now, again, right, the solubility of it is going to be right again about right being dissolved, right. It's the kind of thing that will come when it comes into contact, right, with H2O, right, as a matter of necessity, it's going to dissolve. Right, so it's akin to, it's similar to, right, that kind of intentionality that I'm talking about with my thought, which is about Abraham Lincoln. Similarly, the H2O has, right, this property of solubility, which is right about being dissolved in H2O. Right, it's directed at that.
So following the analogy,
that particular manifestation.
Well, so the analogy would be like, so there's my brain thinking of Abe Lincoln, and the other one you have like salt, water, and it dissolving.
Or just take the quantity of salt, right? That's just on its own. right? Again, not anywhere near any water, right? It's still going to be the case that as soon as you bring it into contact with water, it's going to dissolve, right?
Well, what is the Abe Lincoln like? If we're trying to like draw a connection between each part of the analogy,
Yeah, neither of them is here, right? Neither of them is here. So what you have though is that aboutness or forness, right? That's built into, right, the properties of things, right?
Well,
So the thought
I'm
here
trying to
is,
understand the two analogies. So like trying to make like a one-to-one comparison of each variable in the analogy. So what would in the analogy of the salt, the water, and it dissolving, what would my brain or my consciousness be? What would Abe Lincoln be? And there must be some third variable there, like the aboutness. I don't understand like which part is the analogy of those three variables in each thing.
right. Again, what it's about in this case is, right. So again, what I'm trying to do with the example here is show that, right, in both cases, right, I can have something that's directed at something that's not there, right? Right. In this case, you can, right, my thought about Abe Lincoln is, right, about, right, it's directed at Abe Lincoln, again, even though he's not here, right? So he's not around. Similarly, right, what you'd have is, right, the salt. Now, again, what we're not talking about is mental intentionality. What we're talking about is what, again, George Molnar called physical intentionality. And the thought here is, right, the salt is still, even in the absence of water, is directed at that particular manifestation. And how do you know this? Well, put some water in contact with it. It's going to do this immediately. So the thought here is, on this kind of view, the laws of nature supervene upon, they're made true by, right, the properties of the objects themselves. They're not something in addition. The laws of nature just are these descriptions of the way that things are going to behave, that they tend to behave, right, or they're disposed to behave, right? So the thought here is, again, think about dispositions, right? When something is disposed to do something, right, it's, you could give this sort of description of it in terms of an if-then statement, right? Right. If it were the case, well, specifically a counterfactual, right? So, which is, right, you could say, right, if I were to put this salt in water, it would dissolve, right? So the thought here is the truth maker for that is going to be, it's this power of solubility that it has, which is directed at this particular manifestation, right? It's going to be the case that it's going to do this, and it's because of this sort of intrinsic feature of the salt itself, right, that it's going to do that. So the thought here is just like the thought, right? The thought is directed at something, right? It's directed at Abe Lincoln. Now, similarly, right, let's suppose Abe Lincoln were here, right? In virtue of knowing that believing that Abe Lincoln is here in front of me, I'm going to then exhibit certain dispositions, right? Which one of the dispositions would be that I would walk around him as opposed to walking right into him, right? So you can start now giving a sort of behavior, a dispositional analysis of mental states, right? So something similar is going on here. Notice when you start talking about, right, the properties of objects, and you start talking about the properties of thought, right, what we're talking about in both sorts of cases are having these kinds of dispositions for particular kinds of behaviors. And the thought here is that what we have in the case of thought, right, in terms of conscious states, is just going to be something that we already see in the rest of nature, only it's just going to be something that's distinctive to, in this case, something having a mental life, which is, there's a way it feels like, right, to be in that particular state. Whereas I don't think there's anything it's like to be, let's say, a quantity of sodium chloride. But again, it's, the thought is that it's not that this is something radically discontinuous. It's what we have is a, if you'd like, a sort of continuum, right, that our thoughts are on with the material stuff that our thoughts are made of. Hopefully that makes at least a little bit more sense. I'm not sure, but
Well, I think the part I'm getting lost is like if I've been thinking of Abe Lincoln, I have intentionality of one particular specific entity that isn't there. But it seems like the consequence of how you're defining intentionality in its relation to salt is that any physical interaction it could have with any other substance in the universe, it would have intentionality or equal intentionality for all of those different things. So dissolving in water, being crushed by a black hole.
Yeah, so the thought would be, so a standard sort of view of powers that you'll find in work on metaphysics of science is that powers are multi-track. So they're going to be directed at multiple manifestations with different objects and their properties, right? But notice similarly, you can now start talking about, let's suppose that I have an intention to get a cup of coffee. Let's suppose that I'm in my office, right, at Marist College, and I have an intention to get a cup of coffee. Now, notice that intention now is going to dispose me to do a lot of different sorts of things on my way to getting coffee, right? So it's going to be directed at a lot of different manifestations with different things in my environment. right, as I make my way right to the coffee shop to get some coffee. So the thought here is this idea is that powers are, again, so there are very few powers that people are oftentimes going to say are just directed at one specific manifestation and with nothing else, and that's all they're going to be doing. Most of them are going to be multi-track, as I said, right? They're going to be, right? So you're going to have this salt is going to be, right, in virtue of its properties, is going to be directed at a whole bunch of different manifestations with a lot of different potential partners. So C.B. Martin called this, what do you call it? He called them power nets, is what he described them as, right? So it's like the thought is that when you start taking, right, objects that are the constituents of the universe, they're going to be directed at all these different sorts of manifestations with one another and with other either actual or possible manifestation partners, which could be, right, even things that we're just not aware of, right? But again, going back to, right, the analogy then with the mental state of, let's say, intending, right, that intention is also going to be such that it's going to be manifesting in a variety of different sorts of ways, owing to the goal of getting coffee, right? So hopefully that made a little sense. I don't know.
For me, intuitively, I think that intentions require some kind of an abstract blueprint of something. So, like,
A
I
plan,
have a
yeah.
like a blueprint for building a house or whatever. The blueprint doesn't causally do anything to build parts of the house. I'm looking at it and then I build the house indirectly. The blueprint has no real part in building the house. It's completely abstract. Whereas in the case of salt dissolving, it's more like an actual physical thing causing the blueprint to be formed into the wall, or some more like DNA. DNA literally forces the things to go into the right place based on the bonds to form proteins or whatever. And that seems to be fundamentally different than a blueprint, which represents this stuff but doesn't actually have any causal link to it.
Oh, yeah. Are
Um,
you really going to say that about blueprint? I'm actually inclined to disagree with you, right? So, so take I mean, I take it what you mean by blueprint is what those of us who work in action theory like to call plans. Okay. But it's not clear to me that the plan is causally irrelevant, right? I mean, it's still the case that, right, the content of my intention is playing a clear role in guiding what I do, right? And I take it that if it's playing any sort of role in guiding my behaviors, it's something that's causally relevant.
all right, so
All
I would
you have to
agree
do
with
is a
that.
but for test, right? Just do a counterfactual test. But for that plan, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right
Right.
now, right? So that sounds like it's causally relevant in that sort of way,
Well, that's what I
right?
think the difference is because in the case of the salt, it doesn't seem to be, because the plan is to do literally everything it could possibly do. So there's
Oh,
like a
right. But
plan.
again, let's keep in mind, intentionality isn't the same thing as having an intention. I was just using an example of an intention as one case of intentionality, but right, intentionality is something that could be more or less complex, right, because of the content. In this case, if you think about the intentionality that's characteristic of psychological states, that's going to be much more complex, right? That's going to involve the interaction of a whole lot of different properties, right? And now what we're talking about are the properties of neurons, right, that are interacting with one another, right, in this case, right, to produce a particular kind of an outcome. But notice that's much more complex. I was trying to use a very simple example just in the interest of simplicity. But I think that typically most of the cases that you and I are familiar with, just in terms of just our first personal experience, what we're talking about now are constellations of powers that are having an additive and subtractive effect on one another to produce an outcome that is going to be more or less likely, right, given, right, how the various elements are interacting with one another and the environment outside of the agent, right? So that's going to be, I think, a much more complicated picture. So that's why I was trying to use a sort of simple example in terms of with the sodium chloride, just to say that I think this is something that we see going all the way down, right? If you'd like, there's sort of, if you'd like, if you don't want to call it intentionality, you can call it proto-intentionality, right? But I have a paper with Jesus Aguilar where we argue for a view that we call a gradualist picture of the metaphysics of agency. And we sort of develop this sort of an account where we start with these examples from chemistry, and then we just sort of say what we have is just something that becomes more and more, just we have gradations of complexity. And right, once we reach a certain point, now we're talking about systems that we describe as being full-blooded agents that with a mental life that's more robust. And I can just think of a cat here as an example of this. But the thought here is it's not that there's anything, it's still atoms in the void, as it were, to put it crudely, right? It's still what we're talking about. But what we're talking about now is something that exhibits a kind of functional, integration that's going to be characteristic of, right, a system that we can say, right, is a mind. But again, it's a system of that stuff, that basic stuff, right? That physical stuff, right? That is now, right, exhibiting that kind of unity that's characteristic of a mind. But it's not that there was anything special. There's no pixie dust or anything like that that got thrown into the mix, right? It's just that stuff. So the thought here is right, by appealing to an ontology of causal powers, we could hopefully make some headway in terms of making sense of, the emergence, if you will, again, and I'm thinking of emergence here in a weak sense, of mentality, right? Which is, it's just a more complex version of something that we find, right, in just in more basic stuff in nature, right?
So my initial question is like, by virtue of what do these powers or intentions exist? So like, is there a power or intention for salt to interact with unicorns, like mythical creatures? They don't exist.
No,
So,
they wouldn't, because they wouldn't be part of the universe. So
right.
I think the answer would be no.
So if we imagine a universe that has salt but no water, would the intention or power still exist for salt to
That's a good
dissolve in
question.
water?
I think given its chemical composition, yes, it would still, right? But unicorns are just creatures of myth, right? So, but yeah, in this case, yeah, I mean, in principle, I would have to say yes, right?
Well, what would be the
notice
difference
that's,
here? So, because we can imagine what it
yeah,
would be like if a unicorn did exist. They just don't happen to exist. So, in a
right,
possible world, there's a unicorn, and there's a possible
yeah,
world without water. And so, what would be fundamentally
yeah.
the difference here?
Well, yeah, good. I mean, I'm happy to say it would be logically possible, right, for them to be interacting. But I take metaphysical possibility to be constrained by what there is and the dispositions of what there is, right? So, so the dispositions of objects themselves in the universe, and you know. So I know it's metaphysically possible, right, for salt to dissolve in water. Why? Because it has that disposition to do that in virtue of its powers. Now, do I know what it would do with unicorns? Hell, I don't know. That's an epistemic problem, but I don't think we're going to be able to answer a question like that.
Well, my
Because
question is more like, for each object that exists, does a disposition also exist for how that object would interact with salt? So, if a unicorn popped into existence, would it also entail would the disposition also pop into existence at the same time of how it would interact with salt?
oh no, I think it would have actually already been an intrinsic feature of the salt itself. Yeah, yeah. So if the salt were going to interact with the unicorn, it would already be a feature of the salt. Yeah. So yeah, so it would not be. It would just have to be the case now that the unicorn is just going to have features that are already, again, going to be, unless it's something just radically different. I mean, so that's where I guess the unicorn case makes me sort of scratch my head, because I mean, unicorns, of course, are going to be these creatures of myth, but well, what's going to be the precise nature of a unicorn? Is it just going to be a horse with a horn? If that's our answer, then sure, why not? Right? It's just going to be that, you have this sort of interesting mutation that ended up happening in the history of these creatures such that they developed horns. Cool. All right. I mean, otherwise what you're going to be talking about is something that still, I take it, is going to be just the same sort of physical stuff that the universe is made of. Now, if you start bringing in angels or something like that, though, that are supposed to be wholly other, I don't know what to do. Because now I think what you're now talking about is something that is, I mean, again, I take it that our metaphysics should be constrained by what there is, and by the dispositions of what there is. Anything else beyond that, now we're starting to just talk about logical possibility, right? And I'm happy to say, right, it's logically possible for, I don't know, an angel to dance around on a piece of salt. Sure.
Well, the way I'm thinking of it is, I'm thinking of the intentionalities you're describing as an extra thing in the universe that I don't think I would need. So I'm like thinking, suppose there's salt but no electromagnetism or something. So we have a piece of salt, and in this case, if it came in contact with water, it wouldn't dissolve at all.
Yeah.
And so in this case, if we're comparing this as a possible world and our world as a possible world, does ours have this intention that water dissolves in salt, but that one lacks this intention, even though they have all the same physical features in the universe? Because from my perspective, I'd say, well, the law of physics is what causes this interaction to take place. There's no like intention for it to take place. It's just because of the law of physics of the strong and weak forces are such that they're weak enough that the salt can be dissolved by the water's strong nuclear force or whatever. And I don't think I need to mention these kind of intention things to do that. I think I can just do
Well,
that with the law
as
of
soon as you
physics.
start talking about dispositions of it, I think that you've now introduced directionality talk, and you've now introduced, right? If you don't want to talk intentionality, you can call it proto-intentionality. But again, I'm not talking about intentions in anything like a robust sense. Again, all that I'm talking about here is just that something is directed at a particular manifestation with something else. And lots of things are directed at various manifestations of other things, right? My glass here, right, is directed at a particular manifestation with my table, which in this case is, right, because it's solid with a particular mass, right, and given, right, you know, again, features of the table, right, when I drop it in that sort of way, it's going to make a sound, right? So, I mean, you can start talking about the rate of the rate of acceleration, the rate of gravity, blah, 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 all this other sorts of things. And all these sorts of features together conspire, right, now to allow us to have that sound. It's just going to be that the features of the things themselves are such that, right, when they're combined in a particular kind of way, they're going to do things. Nothing additional, just the laws of nature are just describing what those things are going to do. That's it. And that's all we mean when we start, people who are going to talk about physical intentionality, that's all they mean by that. It's just that things are directed at these various sorts of ways. And now for the purposes of talking about minds, right, the stuff is directed at combining in the certain sort of way such that we can now get systems that are processing information in the sort of way that's characteristic of cognition, right? And right, hopefully, right, the circumstances are going to be such that, right, you could have right, consciousness, right, in that sort of situation. So as being, again, not anything in addition, it's just the stuff itself now being configured in the sort of way that it ends up having this particular quality, right? And it's now acting in this particular sort of way. But what you're talking about is the behavior of a system, and the behaviors of systems are quite different from, let's say, things like, you know, discrete physical particles, right, are going to be very different. And those are going to be much more, maybe not more predictable, but right, the range of things that they're going to be able to do is going to be quite different from, let's say, a complex system, because a complex system is going to be made up of a whole bunch of stuff that is, again, directed at, right, just a wide range of really interesting sort of manifestations, right? So again, compare an organism like you or I to, you know, a quark, right? They're just going to be different, right? One of them is much simpler than the other, right? So, but I take it that they're both just, it's not, there's again, no magical pixie dust or anything like that, right? Once we get to creatures like ourselves, it's just the same kind of stuff.
Are you using intention to be something like synonymous with cause and effect? Causality?
It's part of the picture of causation. Yeah. So the kind of picture of causation that you end up getting on this kind of a metaphysics is one where you've got objects are directed at specific kinds of, right, manifestations when they're interacting with each other. Yeah. So it's a realist, you end up getting a realist picture of causation on this view where it's productive, but it's not this sort of picture that you get from somebody like David Hume, where you've got A at time t1 and then B at time t2, and you've got this sort of chain thing. Instead, what you're now talking about are complex processes of, again, constellations of powers, right, of objects, right? Or differently stated, right, you've got the dispositional properties, right, these objects. And I take it that those things are also just, they're qualities of those things. It's the same thing, right? It's just the same thing under a different description.
So what was different about this approach to causality as opposed to a more classical, like scientific approach to causality?
Oh, well, it depends what, I don't want to, let's make sure we're not begging any questions here. So what do you mean by a scientific approach to causality? So I guess I just sort of punt back to you in terms of a question when it comes to that. So, because on this sort of view, I take it that what we have is we end up having a conserved quantity view on this view, right? So one way to describe what the kind of view that I have here, if you want to describe it now in terms of, let's say, you know, physical causation, would be you would have, right, the transference of some quantity of energy, right? And so it's going to be that you're going to have these physical things that are interacting with one another, and there's going to be some sort of conserved quantity that's going to be, right, the outcome of all of this. And it's something that's measurable, right? Whereas in the case of, let's say, the Humean view of causation that you have is one of just counterfactual dependence, and that's all it is. It's when we have this, we have that. That's it. In this case, what I'm saying is there something that's going on there? So I guess I want to know what you mean then by the scientific view. So.
So yeah, I think something more like the Humean thing would be more like the scientific view, where it's just like, if you have this, then that. It's just a bunch of if-then statements.
If you talk to philosophers of science, you'll find, if you then say, just say the words causal realism in a room full of philosophers of science, including people who work in philosophy of physics, and you're going to see the room just split in half. It's kind of like, you know, when you start talking about, if you get in a room full of biologists and you say group selection, watch what happens, right? It's just going to be, the room is going to, you're going to see the parting of waters. And I think you're going to have something similar when it comes to philosophers of science and theories of causation. So, but this is very much a live debate in the metaphysics of science, for what it's worth. And including among people, the people that I'm talking about right now, who I'm mentioning, who endorse a kind of conserved quantity view. Most of these are people with backgrounds in physics and endorse that sort of view. But again, you also have people with backgrounds in physics, and they're going to say, no, that's bullshit. And they're going to go for a sort of Humean difference-making view. But notice what you're now getting into, though, is a debate that goes beyond, right, the data that we have, right, beyond the evidence that we have, right? So now there's an open question about, right, what do we need to actually really have causation? And here, a person whose work I would strongly recommend that has done, I think, some of the most interesting work on this topic is Anjan Chakravarty. He's got he has a really nice paper about causal realism, and then of course the Humean picture, and he argues for this kind of causal process view, like the one that I'm arguing for right now, where you end up getting a sort of story about how you can get a sort of a conserved quantity approach, right, where now you have something that's measurable that's happening when you have a real causal relation that's occurring. And right, it's in virtue of, right, again, what he calls the causal properties of things, what I'm calling causal powers, and right, and it's in virtue of how those things are interacting to produce particular outcomes. And so that's, again, one person among many who've endorsed that kind of view. But again, if you want to see a very different sort of approach, you know, look at people like Ned Hall and some other people like this who've, you know, taken a sort of counterfactual approach. But when it comes to causal explanation, I just want to grant what you're saying about causal explanations, though. So if you look at work on causal explanation, you don't have to get into these metaphysical debates. This is something that James Woodward has brought out in his own work. So Woodward, his book, Making Things Happen, he presents a model of causal explanation. He's like, I'm not even interested at all in the metaphysics of this. But he says causal explanation in the sciences is, again, this sort of, he tells us interventionist story. I won't go into the details of it, but it is like what you're describing, which is we have this and we have that, right? And then, right, now what's the glue, if you will, for the purposes of the explanation? And is it something that we could manipulate in a certain sort of way? And so that kind of a picture, notice, is just about explanation, though, but it's not about the deep story about, in virtue of what is the explanation true? And that's not a question that he wants to take up. So I think that oftentimes people in the sciences, they're just avoiding the metaphysical question, if you will, right? But then when you get into the metaphysics, that's where you start seeing some really interesting debates emerging, and you have a lot of really smart people on both sides. I'm not saying I'm one of those people, but you have a lot of really smart folks who are taking both sides in those debates.
Would the existence of true randomness, like randomness as an irreducible fundamental concept in nature, be a problem for that view?
That's a good question.
Because like if there is truly a random, undetermined thing that happens,
yeah,
would you have to say that could you say that it has some intention to do the random thing? Because that would seem to be a contradiction. Like if it's truly random, then it seems like it wouldn't have a.
So so there's a distinction that some people have made. This is not my distinction, but I think it's a helpful one, between sort of your sort of standard powers that we talk about, and then spontaneous powers. And spontaneous powers are weird, right? Because now let's suppose that you're talking about, you know, the disposition of some quantity of strontium you know, I can't remember the number. Anyway, some strontium, pick your number. In any case, and its disposition to decay, right, to like beta decay or something like that, right? That's going to be, I think, a spontaneous power, right? It's not in virtue of how it's interacting with anything else that it's going to, right, do that. So I think those sorts of cases are interesting. I'm not sure what to think about those cases, because I think they're still doing something causally, right? They're still producing a particular outcome, right? It's something we're measuring. So it just does it without interacting, right? So the standard cases, I take it, that especially when we start talking about objects that are atoms and larger, right? And we start talking about things that are more stable, right? Is that they are manifested in virtue of how they interact with one another. Whereas you get these sorts of cases of things that are producing outcomes without interacting with anything at all. And I think this is what you're going to have when you start talking about things like beta decay or something like that, which again, I'm measuring it. If I can measure it, then it looks like I'm causally interacting with it. But it's not the case that, right, that it's actually, right, in this case, manifesting beta decay, that it's because of how it was interacting with anything else, right? So those
What
I think
about
are really interesting cases. So yeah.
what about like non-existing particles, virtual particles, things that don't actually exist? Do they also have these kinds of intentionalities and powers?
Well, if they're not real, then no. If they're just virtual, no. If anything, they would be inherited from whatever is realizing that, right? So if it's something, if you're talking about if it's a virtual power, so I guess what you're talking about was something to be generated by an AI or something like that. Is that what you're thinking of?
No, virtual particles, as in the thing that it happens in the Casimir effect, where a particle and antiparticle pop out of existence from nothingness.
Oh,
From
okay, all right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know how to speak to that. I'll leave that to somebody else. I'll leave that to one of my friends who actually works in philosophy of physics.
Gotcha.
That's about my pay grade. I'm used to thinking about things the size of brains and larger, and usually sticking to things that are the size of brains. That's about it. So
That one I'd definitely be interested to hear your thoughts on from someone who knows about your position, because it seems like if there was such a thing as virtual particles and they did pop into existence randomly uncaused, it would probably seem counterintuitive to think that such powers existed for virtual particles. Um,
yeah,
so that would probably be an interesting challenge for your view, which I think would.
yeah. I would actually say reaching out to Anjan Chakravarti would be a person to reach out, because he has a background in theoretical physics, and he's an advocate of this general sort of picture of causation as being a process involving interacting, right, properties of objects, right, causal properties as he calls them, or powers as the rest of us call them. But yeah, it's fine. That's just a terminological dispute. That's it. So yeah, I would say it'd be somebody like that would be a good person to talk to. But of course, an interesting question, and a thing that comes up that is, I think, proves difficult for a view like my own. And of course, this then, right, has implications for what I'm saying about pantheism, is that some people are going to say, look, you don't have intrinsic properties when you start talking about fundamental particles, right? All you have are relations, right? They're all extrinsic properties, right? So Michael Esfield is somebody who's a German philosopher of physics who's pointed this out, right? So he's raised some difficulties, and some people have tried to respond. And there's a live debate going on amongst people working in metaphysics of science who think about philosophy of physics, about whether or not there's any reason to think that there are intrinsic properties of fundamental particles, or if it's just relations, right? So, and what the implications are for this kind of a metaphysics that I'm describing, which is a sort of powers ontology. Esfield doesn't think it's a problem. He just thinks that the powers are just relations. So that's what he does. But so there's an interesting, there's live debates about these things going on amongst people working in the metaphysics of science very generally, and a lot of questions here that I'm not even addressing, that I think, again, prove difficult. I'm happy to admit end up providing obstacles to the tenability of the kind of model of God that I'm interested in.
How do you take like math, square root of -1, I, those kinds of things, the imaginary numbers, like do those things have powers too?
No, I don't think so. I, I mean, I haven't thought a lot about philosophy of mathematics. I'm not a Platonist though of any sort. I have good friends who are, like Eric Steinhardt, yeah, I don't think there's any abstract objects. So I think that mathematics, the truth makers for mathematics, would just be features of the physical universe. So how that would be the case, though, that's goes above my pay grade. So I don't work on those questions. But yeah, my answer would be abstract objects, just they don't have causal powers, and that's a reason for me to think that they don't exist. Right. So that's assuming Alexander's dictum, right? Which is, right, if something exists, then it has causal powers. It makes a causal difference in the world. So if otherwise, it's a non-existent. So yeah, interesting question. There are people, though. I'll just quickly mention there are. I do know, I haven't read this book yet, but Matthew Tugby, I think that's his name, has a book defending a kind of Platonist powers view. So maybe he has an answer to this question, right? So maybe he would say that numbers, right, as well as fictional objects, maybe, I don't know, right, are going to have causal powers. That's going to be, I just don't know how those things would interact with us, though, right, if they're abstract. If abstracta don't exist anywhere. So how do they pair up with our brains? I don't know how that would happen. So that's really tricky to me. I just, yeah. So I'll stay away from it. But my immediate inclination is to just say no.
Cool. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Yeah, I mean, so I have my little book on pantheism, which is quite short, quite an easy read, I think. Well, if you have some training in philosophy, from Cambridge University Press. It's part of the Elements in Philosophy Religion series. It's 30,000 words, so they maybe make it short, which was really hard to do for what it's worth. So in there, I sort of spell out the kind of account of the metaphysics of pantheism that I think is most plausible. But I, along the way, sort of survey, right, some different accounts of, in particular, unity, because that's been one of the things that people have spoken very little about. And that seems to be the biggest problem for the pantheist, right? Is what kind of unity does the universe have to have in order for it to count as being God? And I argue it needs to be cognitive unity. And then I try to consider ways that we might end up having that. But I don't address these Omni questions or any of this other stuff. That to me was already a big enough problem. That and just actually trying to get clear on what the hell we're talking about when we talk about pantheism. So a good bit of that little book is devoted to that. And so I'd recommend checking that out if you're interested in a lot of these issues that we're talking about today are taken up in that little book. So
cool. Thanks again. Appreciate you coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.